Doug Kirkpatrick. Doug is a PLU grad who later went on to earn his law degree from Willamette. He then amassed a very lengthy list of professional certificates, which is also matched by his lengthy professional achievements. Most notably, Doug worked for Morningstar, which is currently the world's largest tomato processor. And as some of you may know, Morningstar was named just 2 years ago as the world's most creatively managed company by none other than the Harvard Business Review. Over the last 20 years, Doug has worked as a full-time coach and consultant. Tonight, he is here to talk to us about his experience and his leadership journey, and hopefully he'll help answer that question, which was originally posed by the founder of Morningstar in the early 1990s. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to one of our own, PLU alum, Doug Kirkpatrick.
That's right. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you. Let me ask a quick question, show of hands. How many people here support increased happiness, harmony, and prosperity? Anyone support those things? Okay. Anyone opposed to those things? Okay. Most people support those things. And yet, we find that if you look at a survey of employee engagement surveys in America, most surveys show that about 1/3 of American workers are engaged and inspired at work, which is great if you're in the 1/3 who are engaged and inspired. What if you're in the 2/3 that are disengaged and disconnected from work? And these same engagement surveys tell us that anywhere from 10 to 25% of American workers are severely disengaged at work. And for the most part, they don't like their bosses. 2 million American workers quit their jobs every month, most of them because they don't like working for their boss. So is there a way out of this management quagmire that we find ourselves in? And by the way, the costs of this disengagement are staggering. You consider that our gross domestic product is about $16 trillion a year. When you have 2/3 of the American workforce working at less than capacity, the costs must be in the hundreds of billions of dollars. So what's the way out? How do we get out of this? Well, we can start by asking a couple of very fundamental questions. Let's start with this question. If people know how to do their jobs, why do they need a boss? Second question. People know how to make life-changing, jugular decisions in their personal lives. No boss tells you who to date, who to marry, where to go to college, what to do for a living, what to major in, whether to buy a house, whether to buy a car, whether to have children. Somehow we all make these major life-changing decisions without a boss. So why is it that as soon as we enter the American workplace, we just can't do anything without a boss? Well, in the spring of 1990, there was a tiny band of colleagues that were working feverishly on a project in California's Central Valley. And there were about 24 colleagues, and their mission was to construct and operate a state-of-the-art food processing facility, specifically to manufacture tomato products. And the reason I know about this is because I was part of that band of colleagues. I was the financial controller. We had about 24 colleagues, and we were working out of a little farmhouse in Northern California. And nearby we had about 500 acres of dirt. That was our construction site. And we were working at about 80, 90, 100-hour weeks. In this little farmhouse, we had an endless parade of customers and suppliers and job applicants and bankers and lawyers and insurance people and regulators and politicians and every other kind of stakeholder, engineers, every kind of stakeholder you can imagine parading in and out. We were trying to get this thing up and running. This was about March of 1990. And we'd moved a little dirt around, but there was still a lot of work to do. And the owner of this company decided to call it Morningstar. And the reason for that was that it's based on the very last sentence in Henry Thoreau's Walden Pond, which says, "The sun is but a morning star." And that was the founder, Chris Rufer's, idea of a vision of perfect results, and so that's the name he chose for the company. And he came in and approached this one day, it was about March of 1990, he said, "You know what, I'd like to organize this enterprise in a significantly different way from every other company that's out there." Because I'd been with him at a prior company that was a very traditional company. And he said, "You know, I've kind of had it with that. In this new enterprise, I want to have no human bosses. And I want to organize the governance of this enterprise on two core principles. The first principle is that human beings should not use force or coercion against other human beings." If you think about it, that's really the foundation of all law, isn't it? Every law everywhere in the world against assault and battery and theft and burglary, rape and kidnapping and murder, all these laws are predicated on the singular principle that people should not use force or coercion against other people. We said the second principle that I want to instantiate here is that people should honor the commitments they make to each other. So if you tell your colleague you're going to deliver a report on Thursday, you deliver a report on Thursday, or you renegotiate the commitment. So I consider these principles to be foundational. They're no different than physical principles, like gravity. So we can choose to respect the principle of gravity and not step off the edge of a tall building and suffer dire consequences. Or we can choose to ignore the principle. It's up to us. And the same is true for human principles. He said, to the degree that we honor these key human principles and make them our central governing philosophy, what will happen? Well, I think we'll have more happiness, harmony, and prosperity, and we'll all do better. So we sat and talked about it for a couple hours. And at the end of the evening, we all looked at each other and said, well, I can't think of any reason not to organize around these principles. Obviously, they make sense. So let's go. And as far as I know, that moment was the birth of organizational self-management, at least as practiced at the scale of a large manufacturing enterprise. So off we went, March 1990. The next 3.5 months were a frenzy of activity. We had hundreds of contractors on the job site, welding, cutting, fabricating, assembling, working 7 days a week around the clock. We had tomatoes coming up out of the ground, anxious growers. We had equipment arriving from Italy on ocean cargo freighters. And finally, on July 16th of 1990, the first load of tomatoes came through the gate. We turned on the switch. And we made 90 million pounds of tomato paste for the world market and changed the cost structure of an entire industry overnight. When people came out to look at the factory, they commented, just a sea of red, and indeed it was. The company continued to grow, not because we had a philosophy of growth or a strategy to grow. We didn't. We had a strategy to pursue excellence. And in the pursuit of excellence, our customers asked us to grow. And so we did. So we added one factory, then we added another factory, then we extended our supply chain toward our customers in the form of remote warehousing, and toward our farmers in the form of trucking and harvesting and transplanting and farming. We added employees. We ended up 400 or so year-round employees and more than 2,000 seasonal employees. Sales grew, approached $750 million. Everyone in this room has eaten Morningstar product. Thank you, by the way, for that. Appreciate it. It goes into everything you can think of, from ketchup to barbecue sauce, steak sauce, pizza sauce, spaghetti sauce, Bloody Mary mix, Thousand Island dressing, and dozens of other products, salsa. We ship around the world. It's a global enterprise. And customers are many names you recognize, many you won't. Kraft, Campbell's, Heinz. And we did it all without a single human boss. A couple of interesting corollaries to self-management. One is that no one can be fired. There's no command authority anywhere in the enterprise, and no one has any authority to go up to any other colleague and tell them they're fired. It's not available. It's not an option. And just as no one can be fired, no one can tell anyone else what to do. I can't walk up to a colleague and tell them to stop doing X and start doing Y. No one can. There's no command authority anywhere in the enterprise. What does that mean? It means that everything is accomplished through trust and communication and request. I can make any request I want of any other colleague at any time in pursuit of the mission. That colleague has an obligation to respond to my request, but I have no command authority whatsoever. This is very unusual for most people. Most of us who have been in the work world have experienced traditional management, in which bosses have power and they can decide your fate in the workplace unilaterally. That doesn't exist. But one aspect of this is that some people adjust very well, and many people adjust very well, but two kinds of people tend not to thrive in this kind of environment. And the first type of person that tends not to thrive in this environment is a person that likes to give orders. They don't thrive in this environment because no one has to listen to them. So what this does is it elicits the phenomenon of natural leadership. It means leadership is something that is earned, not given or conveyed by position. And we have no titles, by the way. Everyone is a colleague, including the owner of the company. There is no title whatsoever. The other kind of individual that tends not to thrive in this environment is the person who lacks initiative, because people just don't have time to organize other people's workflow each and every day. So this kind of ecosystem requires a certain amount of gumption and initiative and grit and perseverance and a willingness to take things on and address issues and deal with things head on. So fast forwarding to 2009, we started the Morningstar Self-Management Institute, and the purpose of that is to instill the principles and systems of self-management wherever people are interested to learn them. And also we had a business author, Gary Hamel, became interested, met one of our colleagues at a seminar, became interested in this concept of management, came out and visited us, took a tour, and spent a day sharing his thoughts and philosophies with our colleagues, Morningstar. And this was 2010, and then in 2011, he wrote an article called First Let's Fire the Managers, but it was conveyed on the cover of the Harvard Business Review as inside the world's most creatively managed company. And from this point, we began to receive a lot of interest in the philosophy of self-management. And what Gary described in his article is what he calls a management tax. He says that management is the least productive thing that any company does. So if you're Morningstar, you want to make tomato products and sell them. If you're Zappos, you want to sell shoes. If you're Gore-Tex, you want to make extreme wear, extreme weather wear, fabric, and other products and sell it. But most people don't want to spend all their organizational energy hiring people, appraising people, disciplining people, going through administrative tasks, dealing with regulatory bodies, and that sort of thing. Management is the least productive thing that any company does. So what do we do at Morningstar? With self-management, everyone is a manager. Every single person is a manager. So the way we instantiate that is we ask people to create contracts with each other, performance contracts, and address the who, what, where, when, why, and how of why are you here? Why do you come to work here every day? We start with a personal commercial mission. Please answer the question, why do you come to work every day, and what does excellence look like in your job, and how does your purpose here align with the overall mission of the company, which is to produce tomato products that meet the product and service expectations of our customers in a cost-effective, environmentally responsible manner. Then we ask people to identify the exact work processes for which they are full stewards and for which they have full responsibility. Why do we do that? Because only individuals can take responsibility for anything. Organizations cannot take responsibility. An organization is a concept. A team cannot take responsibility. A team is a concept. An organization and a team, depending on how it's described, can influence thought and behavior, but it can't take responsibility. Human beings are the ultimate reality. And in self-management, the individual is what counts. And every individual in self-management has an equal voice, an equal right to be heard on any issue at any time. It's not workplace democracy. There's no majority rule. It's just about protecting the voice of each and every individual in the enterprise. So further, on this contract, which we call a colleague letter of understanding, on this contract, we ask people to describe, if they can, the scope of their decision-making authority. If a person is a world expert, and we have some world experts at Morningstar, in a particular subject area, then they probably own all the decision authority for that area. But we try to describe it if we can. And then we identify what we call stepping stones. Stepping stones are performance metrics. So we can have a many-to-one relationship between stepping stones and processes, or a one-to-one relationship. It depends on the process. But we want to measure the performance of each and every process, because otherwise people are not going to know how they're doing. Every individual in the enterprise is responsible for measuring his or her own performance with these performance metrics we call stepping stones. And generally speaking, they're two-dimensional graphs with an x-axis and a y-axis, and we look at the performance curve. And what do we benchmark against? We benchmark against perfection. We think perfection is the only benchmark worth pursuing. We do not benchmark against other companies or other standards or anything else but perfection. So if the goal is efficiency for a process, machine efficiency, boiler efficiency, evaporation efficiency, whatever it is, perfection is 100%. You cannot exceed 100%, theoretical maximum. And then we look at the graph and we see if the graph is bending toward perfection or away from perfection. And depending on which way the graph is going, that will trigger a conversation of some kind with one's peers. That's the only benchmark worth pursuing in self-management. So we've got these colleague letters of understanding. They are interlocked commitments between peers, each of whom has an equal voice, and people sign these contracts. And in the context of the enterprise, they're enforceable contracts. They can be fully negotiated with one's colleagues and peers to sort out exactly how things should be written and how things should be worded, but once they're signed, those are enforceable contracts, and peers hold each other accountable. So that's the secret of self-management. We don't have bosses holding subordinates accountable. There are no subordinates. There's no up or down. There's only work and people that do work. And so we try to use the idea of peer regulation and voluntary commitments made between peers to drive accountability in the enterprise and make sure stuff gets done. In self-management, we virtually never talk about work-life balance. And the reason for that is that work is just part of life. And everyone I've ever worked with has been living, and the same is true for most of my peers and colleagues. But what we try to do is to make work fun. And we make work fun with the stepping stones, because that turns work into a game. So the game of work, by the way, that's a book by Charles Coonrath that we pay a lot of attention to, but the game of work is about coming in and trying to bend those stepping stone curves in the right direction, whatever they might be. So if you're a risk manager, it's what are your insurance costs doing? If you're a production manager, it's what is your throughput and quality? If you're a sales and marketing person, how are your sales doing? What's the profitability of the sales? Those kinds of things. So we just come in and have a good time. We don't have to worry about bosses redirecting us or telling us what to do. We just come in, everyone comes in, they play the game of work. And they work on their own processes and their own stepping stones and try to get things going in the right direction. Try to make work fun. No work-life balance. The other thing that we rarely talk about is empowerment. So the title slide is Beyond Empowerment, the Age of the Self-Managed Organization, which happens to be the title of my book. But we think of self-management as power itself. When you talk about empowerment, that implies that one person who has power is loaning his or her power to another person who has less power. Well, what is loaned can be repossessed in a traditional organization. So we never talk about empowerment because everyone has all the power they need from the first day they start working. They have the power to acquire resources, to build relationships, to make decisions pertinent to their processes. There are no barriers to power at all for anyone at any time. All the power they need. Another concept that's really important to us is the idea that the principles that I described earlier in the introduction are really important to people in the enterprise. And the principles at Morningstar have really basically been unchanged for 23 years. I mean, we brought them into life in March of 1990, and except for a couple of little tweaks and grammatical changes and a word here and there, they're the same as they were 23 years ago. That means they're unchanging, they're immutable, they're fixed. People think of these principles as a constitution. That's the constitution of the enterprise. And the fixed nature of the principles is what lets the people act freely. It lets people enjoy autonomy, lets them enjoy freedom, lets them build relationships, get stuff done freely, which adds to happiness, harmony, and prosperity. The Constitution doesn't change. So a person's work situation does not depend in any way, shape, or form on the personalities or the moods or the cliques or anything else that goes on with the people in the enterprise. That stuff is irrelevant. Now, Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book a couple years ago called Outliers. He describes a phenomenon called power distance. Apparently a jet airliner crashed into a mountain because the co-pilot was just too reticent to describe the impending crash to the pilot who had authority and power. Well, Morningstar, there's no power distance because there's no power. It's a really easy way to solve that problem. And the other thing, we don't really experience ego trips and power trips in the enterprise either. There's a book out called The Winner Effect, How Power Affects the Brain. And it describes that often people get a little jolt of dopamine in the brain when they, experience the giving of commands and experiencing power over others. And that can't happen in this enterprise because nobody has that authority. So we don't have to worry about that. Those kinds of problems go away. We think of everyone in a self-managed enterprise as a professional in every sense of the word. So our core consists of technical people, so engineers, quality assurance personnel, automation specialists, instrumentation people, mechanics, electricians, people like that. They're the people that really make the factories run. And they're well paid because they're paid for their technical expertise, but they're also paid a premium because each one of them is a complete manager. So every one of those folks has a desk, a phone, computer. They make strategic decisions regarding their part of the factory, operating decisions. They order the parts, they order the services, they decide who's going to operate the equipment. Each one of these mechanics in the factory is responsible for about $5 to $10 million worth of equipment, each person. These folks control assets that are so valuable and make decisions that are so large that they have as much or more responsibility as some small company CEOs. They're true professionals in every sense of the word. Excuse me. And they're well paid. They're all salaried. And they're absolutely considered true professionals. We find that freedom brings engagement. So I talked about the engagement surveys earlier. Engagement at Morningstar is off sky high, off the charts. So we've had years where seasonal people come back the following year at 100% rate of return. This is rare if you were to survey companies that have seasonal workforces. Our year-round workforce, our professional folks, people I just described, the retention rates are sky high as well. I mean, why would they leave? They're experiencing happiness, harmony, and prosperity on a daily basis and playing the game of work and having fun. So some researchers have come in and interviewed some of these people from time to time, and they always describe what a blast it is to come to work and how much fun they have at work. Even though sometimes they work long hours and do dangerous, dirty jobs. They still have fun. And they're fully engaged. We find that self-management is a justice-seeking machine. It's a truth-seeking machine. So everyone in the enterprise has the right to question any decision anywhere in the enterprise. And because much information is published transparently throughout the enterprise about performance of different aspects and different business units and different individuals, people can see how things are doing. And they question each other. And there's a process in place to gain agreement. If people have a difference of opinion, they can invoke a gaining agreement process, which basically involves a one-on-one discussion followed by a mediation process. And we find that self-management works very powerfully to create a giant truth-seeking system that tries to get at the truth of every situation. And it also creates a kind of a natural justice system, because people do not tolerate, for the most part, slackers or people that are not honoring their commitments, because the commitments are so precious. So people tend to address and deal with situations that come up, whether it has to do with integrity or performance or any other issue. Things get dealt with. An unofficial justice system. And self-management tends to remove excuses. So in self-management, we consider that excuses have zero value. Excuses have no value whatsoever. Failures, and there are failures, are opportunities to learn. They're chances to find out, gee, what caused that failure? What can we learn from it so that we can mitigate it and prevent it from happening again in the future? That's the only value of failure. Excuses have no value, and people don't tolerate excuses. They really don't want to hear them. They don't listen to them. So some people are skeptical of self-management. And I had a very well-known business professor a few years ago that said, this is a very interesting idea. It's very cute what you're doing, very funky. Yeah, but you know, I just don't think it would work in a complex enterprise. Something like airplane manufacturing, it just couldn't possibly work in a complex enterprise. I thought to myself, are you kidding me? Morningstar deals with thermodynamics, meteorology, enzyme kinetics, cell biology, plant genetics, global currency exchange, and dozens of other disciplines I can't even pronounce. In a global market where everyone in North America is eating our product, in a highly regulated industry, in one of the most highly regulated states in the United States, I think we do a lot more than smash tomatoes. I think we're complex. And we know that self-management works in a complex work environment. Well, a couple of years ago, I described the colleague letter of understanding, and I described the stepping stones. We took the data, and all the colleague letter of understanding data is digital, so we can process it and analyze it and sort it and run statistics on it, that kind of thing. So all the relationships in the enterprise are mapped. We know who's connected to who and what the relationships are between colleagues in the enterprise. So a couple of years ago, one of my colleagues took all this data, this digital data, took it to the University of California at Davis and into a computer lab they called the Cave, and had them map it. It's an actual little cave, so it's a dark cave, and go in and you plot the data, and they kind of project it in space, and they took a picture of it. And here's what it looks like. This is the org chart for Morningstar. Can you see the little connecting lines between the nodes? Okay. So the colors represent the different factories and business units. The connecting lines represent actual formal commitments between colleagues that I described in the colleague letter of understanding, where colleagues directly connect and sign each other's letter of understanding. And we find that, you know, some people are highly connected. They might have a dozen connections. And other people are lightly connected. And sometimes we can figure out who those people are. Some of the research and development people, and we have some PhDs at Morningstar, and they do a lot of heads-down research, so they might not be as heavily connected as others. But the people that are highly connected, we call them mavens. They're connectors. They like to, you know, share information and work with others and collaborate as much as possible. And we find that this is actually, as dense as this network is, it's actually understated, because it does not reflect informal ad hoc commitments that people make to each other on a short-term basis, which happen all the time, every day, throughout the day. And also it doesn't reflect any external stakeholders. So these are just people inside the enterprise, year-round people. Now, if we were to make a movie of this, like a time-elapsed movie, you would see this org chart pulsing and flowing and changing with time, because everyone in the enterprise is free to renegotiate their commitments and their fellow stakeholders at any time. And those negotiations do take place all the time. So what we find is that a couple of ideas come out of this. One is that we think that this is the human equivalent of what they call in information technology Metcalfe's law. And if you ever heard of Metcalfe's law, it says the power of a network is equal to the square of the number of nodes in the network, because every node in the network is potentially connected to every other node. And I think that's true in the case of the human network, because as soon as someone joins the enterprise, whether they have a formal relationship or not, they just begin shooting out connections to people throughout the enterprise, sharing their expertise and absorbing expertise from others. So it creates a very powerful formula for knowledge gain. In a typical hierarchy, and lots of tech companies these days still have hierarchies that were designed in the 1800s, where strategy comes from the top and managers cascade orders down to subordinates. But in a typical hierarchy, knowledge is not absorbed quickly because there's a chain of command that people have to follow the chain of command and go through certain channels and routes. It's very stifling. That doesn't happen here. We also think that this is like, to use a metaphor from nature, this is like kind of like a spider web. You know, if you brush a spider web, you know, you can damage it for sure, but oftentimes it gets rebuilt pretty quickly, and you know, spiders off and running. And spider silk by weight is 5 times stronger than steel. We think that this networked organization is incredibly strong and incredibly resilient. And if a couple of people decided to leave this network, it wouldn't matter. Their roles and responsibilities would be reconfigured and reabsorbed and renegotiated inside the network within hours or days. It just would not matter. Much of the expertise has already been taken in. We think this network is what allowed us to build a factory in 3.5 months, virtually from scratch. If we had to go through channels and hierarchies and chains of command, we never would have finished that first factory. Would not have happened. So we think it also represents a learning organization. Peter Senge, pretty famous organizational author, mostly from the 90s, he talked a lot about learning organizations and how do people learn from each other, and we think this is the best representation of that. And it also provides for extremely strong governance. And again, it's founded on those 2 basic key principles that I described in the beginning that form the constitution of the enterprise. And as long as people can rely on those, they can fit into this network and work and collaborate and make great things happen. It's a very powerful way of doing business. So I'm going to wrap up here with just a couple of thoughts. One is that every organization everywhere optimizes on something. So Zappos, I mentioned Zappos earlier. Anybody buy shoes from Zappos, by the way? Okay. So Zappos optimizes on customer service. And if you ever get a chance to tour Zappos in Las Vegas, it's an amazing place. And they will literally spend 8 hours on the phone with you if that's what it takes to help you figure out which pair of shoes to buy online. They optimize on customer service. Morningstar optimizes on principles. So I described the principles. Let me give you an example. So in 1997, we got a bill for $4,000 from the state of California. Okay, it was an invoice from the Board of Equalization. It said, we want you to pay this new invoice called an environmental fee. Okay. So I was handling legal stuff at the time, and I did some research, and I found that there was no statutory authority anywhere for this invoice. You know, why would we pay something we're not required to pay? It's just a piece of paper. So we protested, and the state said, no, you got to pay the $4,000. Okay, all right. So we protested some more. No, you got to pay the $4,000. Well, being a company based on principle, we decided to sue. So we filed a lawsuit against the state of California. Said we don't think there's any authority for this invoice. And furthermore, we think it violates the Constitution, because corporations have to pay it, but not partnerships. So the San Francisco 49ers, a corporation, they have to pay it, but not the Oakland Raiders, their partnership. That doesn't make sense to us. Unconstitutional. Violates equal protection. So we sued, and our little case kind of wound its way through the courts over the years. And we got into the California Supreme Court. And the odds of that happening are against that happening are astronomical. We got into the California Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, you know what, this regulation that Morningstar is protesting is a Rube Goldberg contraption that makes no sense, basically, paraphrasing. Why don't you guys in the lower courts figure this out some more, because this regulation just makes no sense. So what happened was the law got changed. The governor signed the new law. It got changed. The regulation got changed, so we cured the problem with the Constitution. We spent $250,000 to protest a $4,000 fee based on nothing but principle. How many companies do you know are going to spend $250,000 to protest a $4,000 fee? And we got all that $250,000 back, refunded to us, and the law got changed. So if you can figure out as a company or an enterprise what to optimize on and stick to it, that's worth a lot. So let me just leave you with this thought. Hierarchical organizations started in the 1800s. It was the only way to kind of control the industrial enterprise of the time, railroads, steel mills, things like that. Made sense for the times. It's 2013. If a manufacturing organization can create a resilient and powerful organizational chart like this and give individuals in the enterprise all the power they need to accomplish their respective missions, then no company has any excuse for bosses telling other people what to do. I just encourage you to take a look at the organizations you come into contact with and just ask the question, if people know how to do their jobs, why do they need a boss? Thank you. Take questions if you have any. Yeah.
How do you get a raise at Morningstar if there's no boss?
Right. So people are hired to perform certain responsibilities at certain rates that have to do with the market rate for their services, et cetera, with a premium for their management services. If an individual wants a pay increase above and beyond the cost of living, that individual has to make a business case for that increase. Did you execute a project that had a certain return on investment? What did you do above and beyond your described roles and responsibilities that would justify a pay increase? And if a person needs to seek out some financial or accounting help to help them put together a business case, that's great. But they have to make a business case for it. Yeah.
You kind of touched on it a little about the transparency of the organization. How critical do you think the transparency, and again, can you share what kind of information as a corporate or as an organization you guys share with the entire?
Right. So the colleague letters of understanding are all online, and describe the information so everyone knows what everyone else is doing. The why, they know the processes, they know the performance metrics because we publish those along with each process. They know who the stakeholders are, who is that person's colleague letter of understanding signatories. All that information is spread everywhere. It's available everywhere at all times.
What about salaries, profit loss, all that other information?
Right.
Transparent, everything?
Right. So every business unit has we have different areas of the factories and different functions that have formed into business units. So we have a marketing business unit, engineering business unit, et cetera, and they create their own profit and loss statement, and then that's available if anyone wants to look at it. Those P&Ls for the business units are available. Salaries are not available yet. Some companies have published salaries. I think Semco, Ricardo Semler, Maverick author, I believe his company began publishing salaries several years ago. I think it would be a good idea. Right now, there's some hesitation. People are nervous about that, so it hasn't happened yet. But I could see that happening down the road at some point. Yeah.
Question about the contract negotiation part. I think it's very interesting. However, when you negotiate a contract, you always have a conflict. So, for two businessmen, when you negotiate a contract, you don't have a agreement. You can go different ways. But in the same company, you have the same goal too. So, how are you dealing with the conflict?
Yeah. Thank you. Great question. So I just glancingly touched on this. The gaining agreement process that I mentioned, that's also a conflict resolution process. So if an individual detects a lack of performance in a fellow colleague, they can make any request pertinent to that performance. They can actually ask the person to leave the company. But it's a request, not a directive. And then that individual has an obligation to respond. And if sometimes people have been asked to leave and the other person agrees and says, yes, okay, I haven't been paying attention to my job, I'll leave. And then the conversation's over. But if they disagree, we bring in a third-party mediator and they try to work it out with the mediator. If that works, great. If it doesn't, we bring in a panel of fellow colleagues, 3 to 10 other colleagues, and they sit around a conference table and try to work it out, just like with a mediator. And if that works, great. If it doesn't, then we flip it over to an arbitration process, and we document the difference of opinion, and we ask the arbitrator to review it and decide. Yeah. So I'm trying to, as long as management textbooks talk about traditional management, not self-management, I'll be talking about this stuff to my last breath, because I see no inherent barriers to the implementation of self-management, because it's how people live their lives already. That's how people organize their own personal lives already. And so we did it here with a manufacturing company. We see no barriers to scale if we were to double in size or triple in size. We see no inherent barriers to scale. See no barriers based on complexity, as in the business professor I described. I have been approached by a global manufacturer of some 80,000 employees that's interested in this process. So I can tell you, self-management shows up in surprising places. If you look at the U.S. Navy, when they're in flight deck operations on an aircraft carrier, all those people are self-managing. Hierarchy would be stupid. It couldn't possibly work. People just have to be left alone to do their jobs. And, the Blue Angels, the Thunderbirds, those people, they are flying at 500 miles an hour, 2 feet apart. There's no hierarchy there. They're working as a team. And they're coordinating their activities and they're measuring their performance afterward. Self-management is everywhere already. So I'm just trying to open people's eyes to help them see it where it is. Yeah. Good.
Without formal leadership in the organization, how do you guys handle crisis management?
I'm trying to think of what that would look like. What would be an example of a crisis? Disaster? Okay. All right. Okay.
People tend to naturally look towards someone for direction, even in personal life.
Right. So it's a little complicated, but we have this concept we call rings of responsibility. And so we say that everyone's responsible for their own personal mission. But in the same sense, everyone is, in a sense, responsible for everything. And the way that works is, if your job is to do nothing but come in and sort tomatoes in the morning for 8 hours, and then you're walking to your car in the parking lot after a shift, and you happen to notice a fire breaking out in the warehouse, you do not have the option of just getting in your car and going home. If you see that problem, you own the problem. And you have an absolute affirmative obligation to address it, either by reporting it to someone or taking a fire extinguisher out there yourself and putting out the fire. So we like to think of it, self-management, this way. Who's more likely to notice issues and problems and crises? A manager who wanders through a work area 5 or 6 times a day, or a fellow colleague who's working side by side with you all day long. We think the colleagues are more likely to spot issues, and we don't empower them, but they have the power to deal with issues that they spot. Yeah.
What is the underperformer typically give up in negotiation?
Not sure I understand.
Like, if it's not performing up to their contract, do they say, okay, I'll take less salary because I'm not performing that well?
That's possible. I mean, that might be something someone would offer, but why? I don't think their colleagues would accept that. I don't think that would be non-performance or underperformance is just not tolerated. So they have to figure out ways to improve the performance or find a different situation where they can do a good job. Yeah, great question. It's very lengthy and rigorous. And in our competency models, self-management competencies are a good 50% of every competency model. So we look for things like initiative, tolerance for ambiguity, leadership and teamwork skills, communication skills. All those things are self-management competencies, and those are very, very important in the hiring process. So we identify, everyone in the enterprise has the obligation to identify the need for additional talent and resources. So anyone can say, we need another electrician in this factory. Great. So then we analyze it. It makes sense. We'll do a financial analysis and a workflow analysis. Yeah, it makes sense. So then we have colleagues who have some HR type skills. They'll go out to the marketplace. They'll bring in candidates. The people that make the hiring decisions are the stakeholders themselves. Electricians hire electricians. Mechanics hire mechanics. Accounts payable clerks hire accounts payable clerks. And so a person comes in, we have a testing process to determine basic expertise, and if the person is qualified technically, then we get into a lengthy interview process with all the stakeholders. So every electrician has to sign off on an electrician candidate. And if they do, they come on board. It can take months to get hired once you submit a resume with all the interviews. Yeah.
So in the scenarios that you've described, I can understand how full-time employees work. How do part-time as needed, the company obviously has those.
Yeah, over 2,000 seasonal people, and they're paid hourly. In the factories, they're doing sorting and driving forklifts and things like that. They often have handwritten paper colleague letters of understanding, but they are governed by the exact same principles as everyone else. And they have the exact same rights and the same voice as everyone else in the enterprise. They cannot be fired unilaterally. And they can ask people to leave. A seasonal person can ask a year-round colleague to leave the company under these principles because they don't change. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thanks.
One more round of applause. This is a success story for PLU.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks.